It's all in your head. You don't look sick. Your tests are normal. It's probably anxiety. There's nothing wrong with you. Have you heard these words from physicians, family, and friends? If you're someone who has been swirling through the revolving door of healthcare to find answers about your health, or if you know someone who is going through this experience, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast with Laura Nozicka. Hello and welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. I am your host, Laura Nozicka, and it's been a while. I took a little break through the holidays and went to Hawaii with my mom, and it was lovely. But let me tell you, it was a travel nightmare getting back to Chicago. And if it would be anything like a healthcare experience, it would be like trying to get a hold of doctors instead of airlines and scheduling coordinators instead of hotel reservations to book a hotel so we wouldn't have to stay overnight in the airport, which we almost did. But I think being overnight in a airport in a lot of ways is like staying overnight in a hospital. The cafeteria is closed. There's less staff. You can't get any sleep. There's strangers all around you. It's not your doctor, but the hospitalist who only knows you by your chart. And oftentimes no one knows you and you don't know how long your procedure is going to be delayed. And so all kinds of planes, trains, and automobiles in our trip back to Chicago from Hawaii. And we're going to talk today about those challenges in healthcare as well, which is why I'm excited, grateful, and honored to have today's guest on my show. And he is dubbed the People's Voice in Healthcare by People Magazine. Matthew Zachary is a 28-year brain cancer survivor who turned personal adversity into a global movement for change. As the founder of Stupid Cancer, he launched the young adult cancer movement and created the Stupid Cancer Show, the first healthcare talk radio show. Today, Matthew hosts the Top 10, which is why I'm so honored that he's on my show here. He hosts the Top 10 podcast, Out of Patience, and produced the award-winning documentary, The Cancer Mavericks. As principal of Matthew Zachary Worldwide, he leads a trailblazing consultancy, redefining healthcare with bold, empathy-driven strategies that amplify patient voices and disrupts the status quo with his sharp wit and Gen X edge, which could I be more excited about that? I'm referencing Friends, different Matthew Perry, not Zachary, but I am excited. He inspires patients and organizations alike to embrace authentic storytelling and drive meaningful change. And I also learned through my research that he is an accomplished concert pianist. So, oh my gosh, I'm so excited, Matthew, to have you here. Welcome. And it's nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.
Awesome. So here I've got you, this rock star, on the show today. And despite the fact that you find it rather gauche or left bank of me to be recording my podcast on
No, it's fine.
Zoom.
I reserve judgment for people I like. So
Oh my gosh, me and my little setup here, but we all start somewhere. So yeah, but thanks for agreeing to join me today. I'm not quite as fancy as you are, but I am digging the shirt. Is there a story behind the shirt?
actually, there is a story behind the shirt. So the only time I ever won in Vegas, um, I think I won like $1,000 on a slot machine. Ever. I've never won any time ever. Not that I gamble a lot, but proportionally, it was a big deal that I finally won some money for the first time.
Yep.
And I was at the MGM Grand in May of 2018. And I had just lost a lot of weight that year before I gained it back during the pandemic.
Yeah. Welcome to that club. Yes.
And I decided I wanted to treat myself to something that I don't really self-indulge on anything. If I have one guilty pleasure, it's bourbon, but those aren't terribly expensive.
Good choice. Good
And
choice.
yeah, and there was a store in the MGM by a designer I'd never heard of before named Robert Graham. Apparently, Robert Graham was a big deal. Has been around a long time. And there was this shirt that was just so nonsensically ostentatious that I had to buy it. And I said, I'm just going to wear this because I'm probably buzzed enough at 2 in the afternoon after winning $1,000 to want to buy a shirt that everyone will say, "How the hell are you wearing that? I look good in it." And this shirt was $595. Just for precedent, I've never worn a shirt more than $30.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
So I fell in love with Robert Graham that day. And then I realized that not all of his shirts are that expensive, but if I have a moment to splurge on something nice, I will buy a Robert Graham shirt. So since 2018, I've been wearing Robert Graham, and this is one of those shirts.
Well, awesome plug for Robert Graham, and he's not a sponsor.
Not a sponsor. I wanted
Not
to
a
be a
sponsor.
sponsor. Hey, Robert Graham, if you're listening, please be a sponsor.
Let's see if we can round that up for you.
I know.
That's
Works some magic.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah. So now I can take it off the list to ask you questions like personification questions. If you were a shirt, what kind of shirt would? So
Robert Graham.
we got
If
that
anyone sees
out of the
any
way.
photos of me anywhere in public at all since 2018, I'm wearing a Robert Graham shirt.
That's fantastic. That's awesome.
And they're all, like, half off last season on Loft or something like that.
Well, more reasons.
Nordstrom Rack.
More reasons to go to Vegas, do some day drinking, make a couple bucks, do something with your return on your investment, and get an awesome shirt. I think that's a great plan.
It's just so American that I didn't save it. I just spent it right away.
Well, when you're
Guilty
day
as charged.
drinking, you're not really rationalizing much of anything at that point.
No.
But in any case, well, Matthew, do you prefer Matthew or Matt or hey you or what?
Yo, that guy.
Yo.
Dude.
Yeah, dude. Oh, that's so Gen X.
Anything is fine. Matt's fine. MZ is fine. People call me MZ.
Okay. Yeah. Any Gen X reference I'm excited about. So yo.
Not Ducky, but yeah.
No, we'll avoid that for a different conversation. So Matthew, with all of the accolades and all of the work that you've done, and trailblazer is absolutely the right word for you. I'd like to kick off and learn about your story. And boy, it's been a long journey for you, but what an impact you've made. But walk us through where it did start for you and what led up to your diagnosis. Let's kick that off to get started here.
Yeah, well, I officially joined the club no one ever asked to be a part of, with a brain cancer diagnosis 29 years ago, in December of 1995. So that was the start of this. But prior to that, I was just a kid with a dream that wanted to be John Williams. And I went to college for music. I started playing when I was 11. I learned classical, jazz, big band, orchestra. I played in Sing back when Sing was a thing in high schools in the 80s in New York City.
Yeah.
Did talent shows. I played at an Italian restaurant, literally playing Italian restaurant, Village Hills at an Italian restaurant. Went to summer camp, did music direction, and went to Binghamton to, major in this and go to USC Film School to write for Hollywood. That was my lot in life. And then man plans, God laughs.
Big, hairy, audacious dream. Yeah.
Why not? Right. Go big.
Yep.
And long story short, prior to my diagnosis, I lost the use of my left hand. Fine motor coordination was eroded. Couldn't grip a pen, couldn't play piano, couldn't type. Misdiagnosed for 6 months, not taken really seriously. Finally, had like a bit of a seizure, was taken seriously, slurred my speech, my eyes went sideways. And there's something really wrong with this kid. And finally got an MRI. And boom, they found this giant thing inside my cerebellum. Like, thank God it's something. I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
But what the hell do we do now?
Yeah. So I was listening to your talk with the Brain Tumor Association, and I think you said that the prescription for your tingling in your left arm was Robitussin. So what do? Do you go home and say, "Hey, Ma, do we have any cough stuff in the cabinet? Doc says it's gonna fix up this tingling thing, no problem." Like, what do you do with that?
I was subjected to the medical prowess of SUNY Campus Medical Services at the time because I was upstate at school.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'll give them credit. I don't want to throw them under the bus, but you don't think brain tumor when you think 21-year-old kid with a headache. You just don't. Wouldn't. Oh my God, you have this, and my symptoms weren't, I guess, typical of what they would identify as brain tumors in children at the time, because typically you start with a seizure, or you start with imbalance, or you start with, peripheral problems seeing things. My earliest symptom was I couldn't play piano with my left hand. That is the least likely thing to trigger this guy's got brain cancer.
Mhm.
So I don't fault them for telling me that I had everything, Epstein-Barr, mini stroke, carpal tunnel syndrome, multiple sclerosis. And then finally, you're probably just, you need some rest, have some Robitussin. True story. Robitussin for brain cancer doesn't cure brain cancer. So
We don't need
again,
to
it wasn't.
start that. We don't need to start that
Yeah.
rumor. That
Coming soon, my new book, Robitussin for brain cancer, on store shelves soon.
well, there'll be a rush on that. Like it's not enough that it was toilet paper. It might be
I
Robitussin.
know. Yeah, exactly. So that's the origin story of what got me into the club. And yeah, no, there was no data back then on pretty much anything, because it was the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
But the doctors had never seen a kid with this particular type of brain cancer called the medulloblastoma, which is a very common tumor in children. But over the age of 12, it was highly unlikely, rarely ever seen. And I was double that age almost. So kind of threw them in for a tizzy. What do we do with this kid? He might not make it 6 months, even though we did surgery. We're going to give him like a Chernobyl radiation in the easy bake oven for a couple of weeks and see if he lives. And then maybe some chemo if he's alive. There was nothing. There was nothing to give us any sense that epidemiologically or clinically or academically I'd be alive in 6 months. It was just really like, let's just see what happens. And that's kind of what cancer care was in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you mentioned also in your talk that you had almost this relief that it was a something versus a nothing, and it wasn't all in your head. And that's something that I talk about a lot when I have patients on my show, and I've talked about it with physicians as well, where patients go on having these symptoms and it's doctor after doctor, test after test, and they just are not getting any answers, and they walk away with this feeling that they're being dismissed, and it's all in your head. In your case, I suppose literally it was, but
Yeah.
from a figurative standpoint, you were you at that point where you thought, oh, maybe I am nuts with this tingling issue. Maybe it is just stress and anxiety or whatnot.
Well, I have congenital chutzpah. I've always been a precocious kid. And I knew something was wrong because I couldn't play piano. It wasn't like you're questioning whether, oh, just try harder to play piano. No, look at my hands. They don't bend. They
Yeah.
don't, my fingers don't move. There's definitely something wrong with me. So when they said it's all in your head, and someone actually did say that to me, uh, yeah, this echoes the conversations I had with so many other people who were just relieved that it's like mystery diagnosis. That last 5 minutes, they find out you have this 38 syllable and probably incomprehensibly unlikely thing. And you're like, thank God I have epithelio, da, 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 da. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
that
just
only
happy.
two people in the world
Yeah.
have, but you
I
figure,
was, there's something in my brain that's messing this up. Thank God I'm not crazy. It's there. Holy shit. What do we do now?
yeah, yeah. And so you said that you had radiation. Was that so? You had surgery, right? And what was
That
what's
part mattered the most, I think. Getting it out
yeah.
of my head to the best that they could do it was probably, that's why I celebrate my cancerversary as my surgiversary,
Mm-hmm.
not as the day I was diagnosed or my last day of care. Because just getting it out of my body, first and foremost, probably the best thing. Very Ridley Scott. Just get it out of my body.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure. Yeah, and I'm sure just from a psychological standpoint to know that the thing is gone, and okay, now what's next? What's the next track? So
Right.
then you said you went through radiation, and you were 21? Was that it? Was that right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was 21, and because it was like the rarest thing I'd ever seen, they convened a tumor board, which they don't do that much anymore. But the tumor boards were like you bring the top 5 or 6 humans on the subject matter to discuss the prognosis, and they're supposed to come back with a recommendation of whether we do nothing, go home, uh, certain levels of radiation, certain parts of radiation to certain parts of the body, at what intensity, if there's chemotherapy, what kind of chemotherapy, if there's a bone marrow transplant, all sorts of permutations were discussed. And they came back to my dad and I because my mom had fallen to some severe, depression and anxiety at the time. It was really my dad and I. We don't know what to do with you. Good luck. So the top 8 pediatric neurologists of the country are like, yeah, we don't know.
Wow. And I
Yeah.
think you said too that they were talking mainly to your dad. They weren't really talking to you as the patient.
Oh, you did your homework. Yes.
You did.
Yes, they
Yeah,
were
you sure did.
because I was in pediatrics.
Yeah, you're
Normally, young
in
adult.
that. Yeah, you were in that weird space of aging out into adult care, but too old to be really pediatric, but you're still in this bucket of pediatric patient.
Yeah, they tossed me into peds because the tumor was pediatric. Medulloblastoma is congenital. You're born with it.
Mm.
So you don't just develop it like glioblastoma later in life. And not to jump ahead, but young adult cancers typically you're with 80-year-olds. But I was with 8-year-olds. So I had the opposite experience of a young adult where I was people thought I was the parent
Mhm.
of a child who was sick at the time. And the doctors, their job is their job. They're not used to talking to patients that can talk back. I was probably the oldest patient they'd seen in years who knew how to have a conversation with them, and yet my parents are in the room and they're talking to my parents.
I've heard that a lot. I've had 2 young ladies, Gen Z on my show, and they didn't have cancer, but one was dealing with long COVID, and the other one had been diagnosed with Lyme disease when she was 12, but starting to have symptoms when she was 7. And they both said the same thing. They were old enough to where they could speak up for themselves or at least articulate what their symptoms were, and the doctors were just not listening to them, but were directing all of their recommendations and conversation to the parents. So for you, what's going through your mind at that point where you're not being heard?
Yeah, I just try to give the benefit of the doubt, which is, I guess, one of my flaws, is I tend to do that. Is they weren't ever used to talking to patients. So for me to have an opinion and say why when parents who have kids that are sick, like, do anything to save my child. And of course, my parents wanted that too, but I had autonomy. So I get to ask questions. Why this? Why this? Why this? What about this? And they just were not prepared to have the empathy they needed to know that I wasn't just a blob, like a loaf of bread, like a three-month-old kid. So
Versus a very accomplished young man, student, driven, everything going for you. They're not necessarily thinking of you as a person at that point.
right after the fact, it's like one of those, like, it would have been nice if, and this is still like a through thread to today's narrative and people getting sick, is they didn't disclose a lot to me that they probably should have in terms of side effects and where you should be headed, how you should be taking care of yourself, what you should and shouldn't be eating. Um, it just wasn't there. Um, I'd like to think things are better now where you're kind of told in advance that these are going to happen to you and here's things you could do to mitigate. But
Mhm.
something as simple as antiemetics, which today are, Benadryl at the school buses, like, the stuff that I took in the 90s, but it wasn't even at the level that worked back then. I had to beg for it.
Mm.
I had to beg for it. I didn't even know they existed. Why would I know what antiemetics are outside of like puking in college, which I didn't do? So another thing that they could have told me, which would have been nice, was that I lost my salivary glands. They stopped working because of the radiation to my head and neck.
Mhm.
And there was a medicine that helped you make saliva. Would have been nice if they knew about that. I happened to my dad found out about it in an article, in an ad in a cancer magazine on an end table somewhere. So
Boy,
we actually
we
went to the
could
doctor, said, "You have this?"
we could talk forever about pharma advertising too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're a whole nother conversation. But I'd like to talk more about how support has changed
Oh,
for
yeah.
cancer patients. But as I understand it, you refused chemo, which I think for most people would probably be a pretty, especially back then, would be pretty radical. But from what I understand, it was good old Uncle Jay who put some perspective on the chemo cocktail that you were being recommended, and it changed. Good, sounds like it changed the course of history. Tell us about Uncle Jay.
Yeah, the uncle anyone listening can or watching can check out my Uncle Jay story. It's literally riddled across anything I've ever written on Substack or LinkedIn or my shows or whatever. My dad's best friend is Uncle Jay, Dr. Jay Tishfield, the pioneer of chemotherapy. He built the University of Indiana Bloomington's entire genetics laboratory in the 70s and 80s. Incredible human being, my godfather. And he took an active interest in what the hell these doctors were going to do to me. Obviously, it was good to have him in my corner. I happened to have him as my uncle. And when we done with the radiation, I was on death's door after radiation.
Mm.
I had lost conceivably every ability. I think I said I lost my life, but I didn't die. A shell of a human being, burned, scarred, bald, puking every day, couldn't eat solid food, impotent, infertile. You name it. It was just like it was almost as it almost killed me more than the tumor would have done. And then they're like, "Well, let's give you chemotherapy." Like, what the hell is chemotherapy? Like, we don't know these words.
Hmm.
And again, on the theme of it would have been nice to know in advance what this thing was. They didn't tell us. They said, "We're going to give this crap to you," whatever it was. So Jay stepped in and said, "What are you going to give to my godson?" And they said, "Who the hell are you?" It's like, "I'm Jay Tishfield, bitch." Oh my God. So Jay actually
Did that come
got
with
the,
that snap?
he did. He pulled the card, and he deserved to be able to pull the card because he earned the card to pull. And they told him the protocol, which was just so impossible to even conceive would happen, even by today's standards with data sharing and privacy rights and HIPAA, whatever. I don't think HIPAA was there yet.
No.
And they told him, "We're going to give Matt this, and this." And two of the chemotherapies at the dose they were talking about would have permanently ruined my piano career. Permanently ruined it. If I were to ever live and play piano again, which is really all I really cared about back then. Can I just move on and start playing again? I really want to rehab and
Yeah.
go back to
Okay.
grad school. One of the medicines was called cisplatin, which at the dose they were going to give me would have caused near guaranteed hearing loss.
Which I think is still used today.
It is, and now there's medication that mitigates that somewhat if you happen to know about it. But cisplatin is now used in better combination cocktails that doesn't have the same level of of I don't know, acerbic outcomes.
Yeah.
Not a doctor, don't know that, but the other one was called vincristine. And vincristine causes permanent nerve damage in your peripheral neuropathy. Is the medical term for it. So here I was, ready to say, "Save me at any cost. Give me your chemotherapy for a year." And I would have lost the ability to feel my fingers and toes and hear.
Mm.
Not good for a pianist wannabe. So Jay stepped in and said, "Matt, you would rather die in 6 months and get your piano skills back the way you care about, or live 80 years and never have it again." Now, just think about a 47-year-old man telling his 21-year-old godson those words with my parents in the room. How are you supposed to make a decision on that?
Because what were they telling you, Matt? As far as, well, you had radiation. Now you're up on the stand for chemo. What were they saying in terms of X amount of improvement, or least likely to recur? Were you getting information like that to be informed in order to say, "Oh, you're only going to improve my longevity mortality by 5% or whatever, 10%," to say, "Okay, yeah, that's not worth the hell of chemo. No thanks. I'm moving on, going back to school. Bye-bye." What
Yeah,
did you have to
the
base
bravado
your
and the hubris. The
Yeah.
bravado and the hubris were off the charts. And my dad remembers this more than I did sitting in the room, but my precaution, "Oh, I'm done. When am I gonna die? You said I'd be dead by now. Why am I alive?" And said, "We're gonna give you a 50% chance to live for 5 years." Like, great, the 26 years old. I hate that. Why do I care about this? And then with this chemo, that'll bump it up to what? 80, 90%. I'm guaranteed to live? No, 55%. So on top of the fact that even if it worked for the rest of my life and that extra 3 months of percentage would have mattered, did I really want to risk never playing piano again, never being a musician again, never hearing music again the way I wanted to? I had spent 11 years of my entire life building up this life for myself. It's the only thing I cared about. I had no other, I mean, I tinkered with computers, but I had no other aspirations in this world to just go write and listen and hear and compose and create. That was just the decision that was made. It's not worth it. Even if the 5% was 80%, it wouldn't have mattered if I'd be dead in 5 years or 5 years and 3 months. I'd rather be dead in 5 years and 3 months as a pianist.
Mm.
So I
So,
told them no. They got really mad at us for saying no.
yeah, you were defying their recommendations. You were
Yeah.
bruising their egos. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, just a little asterisk for the listeners or anyone watching. I don't endorse saying no to chemotherapy in 2025. It's way better. That's kind of a that's a terrible statement to say
Is
it
that
that way.
air quotes, way better? Yeah.
It's way less horrible from certain vantages than it used to be, and it has superseded radiation as a better way to get better outcomes.
Yeah.
So this was unique to me in 1995 when there were only 4 drugs in the world for cancer pretty much. Now there are 30 billion of them. You can't afford any of them. But I would highly recommend considering that this is probably to your benefit to listen to the doctors today because there's more on the table. There's more accountability. There's more transparency. There's more options and choices. And it's in their interest for you to live. So just a caveat to close that out. I'm not saying everyone say no to chemo. Don't do that. Please don't do that.
Okay. Thank you for saying that. But I think it sounds like you were a little bit of a tech nerd because you said you were tinkering with computers, which I love that you talk about DOS and floppy disks because, boy, we don't even
Yeah.
run those anymore. But
Wayback Machine.
what's that?
The Wayback Machine.
The Wayback Machine. That's right. That's right. Actually, my dad had one of the first um, PCs that was in like a carrying case. You could carry it
Mhm.
everywhere, and it was about this big, but the screen was about this small.
Yep. Super
Uh,
tiny.
we might still have that. I don't know if that's worth anything, but it should go to the Smithsonian, I'm sure, at this.
Probably.
But thinking about the techie part of your world, how do you think Google would have changed your experience if Google were around way back then?
Are you saying if 1995 had the same level of Google as today?
Of information, yes. Mhm.
Oh, it'd be terrible. Google is horrible when it comes to finding shit you need to find out about that you never thought to look for. I just wrote an article. I don't know when this is going to air, but I just wrote an article called about how Google is the one thing that determines whether you live or die that we don't talk about. Because knowing shit exists that you never thought to look for is not on Google.
Well, and for a lot of patients too, and I think I told you that I'm a moderator, market researcher by day for pharma and healthcare companies. I don't work for one in particular. I'm independent. Let me just put that out there. But patients talk all the time about how either either they're hardcore researchers and they want every piece of data that they can get on their disease, the chemo cocktails, their medications, etc., or they listen to their doctors who they're good with just straight advice from the doc, and they are told to ignore the statistics. And knowing the statistics is almost worse than just going about your business, keeping the faith, doing what your doctor says. But
Right.
there's so much out there that you can just work yourself up into a frenzy, and you know too much at that point. I think there's something to that too.
The thing that I find valuable in search engines sometimes, and this is highly contingent and variable, I'll just predicate this by saying that, like getting cancer is walking into a mall with no stores and no directory. You never want to shop there. There's no greeter, there's no aisles, there's no mile markers, there's nothing that tells you what to do. So you don't know what you need. There are certain organizations that have the right budgets that can pay Google to tell cancer patients that are searching for things, here's stuff you need to know. But it's not vetted in a way that matters to that person seeking information. The happens to find or happens to know, I happen to have Jay, people happen to have an uncle who's an oncologist or a brother that's a this. Whether you live or die shouldn't be dependent on what you happen to accidentally have access to. So what people are looking for now more than ever is a combination of the clinical decisions that they have to make versus how do I pay my rent? How do I talk to my kids? I'm all alone. How do I tell my employer this? How do I navigate insurance? I need someone to help me unfuck my hospital billing bullshit. Like these are all lifestyle practical issues that you can't find answers to on the internet unless you're lucky. So what I needed back then wasn't that because I was 21. I was under my parents' insurance. I wasn't employed. The college said, fine, we'll let you graduate, cancer kid. So I was in a different circumstance. There was no mass media. There were no choices. You either got chemo and radiation or you died. So there were no immunotherapies. There were no biomarker tests. There were no genetic predispositions. There were no diagnostic tools. There was nothing at all. So Google would have had nothing to tell me, even if it was biased back in those days. If it were today, I don't know. I don't know. And I'll wrap that up in a bun by saying people come to me all the time as their Google because they happen to know me. I'm the Uncle Jay of this generation. So I'm not a fan of Google as a doctor or a therapist
Mhm.
when you don't know what you're looking for. But when you want to shop for a fridge, go for it.
Yeah, the shopping process is way different when it
Yes.
comes to cancer, and I think as a young person, and again the two young ladies that I had referenced earlier, one having issues with long COVID and the other one with Lyme disease, they both we talked about this. We talked about how there is this gap, which I believe you recognized for young people with illness, chronic illness, and certainly cancer specifically, that there's this gap for support, which is why you started uh Stupid Cancer. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The data was just coming out of the late 90s that survival rates in young adults at that time were Gen X. Survival rates in Gen Xers in the early 2000s were terrible compared to kids in Medicare, Grandpa and Timmy. So the rationale beyond why made sense because we are only 6% of diagnoses and robot tests for brain cancer. We don't show a lot of symptoms. Um, there's no early detection or prevention measures. Self exams aren't taken seriously by primary care doctors. We get different types of cancers, mostly hematologic and sarcoma based. Some testicular, some, very little brain, not many solid tumors in young adults. So there was a lot of complexity into understanding that data first and foremost. So the challenge was going to be how do we educate oncologists, primary care doctors, employers that Gen Xers can get cancer. And while it's rare, you have to be aware of it and prepare them so that when they enter the mall, there are some stores in there. And it worked. It really worked. We had to raise a lot of hell for it. We spent years raising hell for it, but eventually there are tangible, tactical implementations and infrastructure now across the entire continuum of employer-based care, state mandates, Medicare, Medicaid. Even the Affordable Care Act did two things we cared about the most, which is no pre-existing conditions and up to 26 years old and your parents. Those were, those went like, those are milestones that should be celebrated. As much as you can tear apart ACA for whatever it didn't do right, it did what Gen Xers needed it to do. So my article from Stupid Cancer was in the news yesterday in Time Magazine, like 18 years after I was in Time Magazine for Stupid Cancer back in 2007.
Congratulations.
And it was super cool to see them talk to her again. My successor, Allison, shout out to her. And yeah, I talked about how we had to machete through a jungle, but now the road's paved. So does it make it easier? Probably. Is it not perfect? Of course. But if we didn't do what had to get done on behalf of an entire generation, which is now Gen Zers going
Mhm.
through this, that hopefully have the pavement, it wouldn't have gotten done. But it all started with realizing through the data that survival rates in young adults had not really improved over 20 years compared to kids and older people.
And there's so much around cancer now. We hear about it so often, and I don't know, some days I feel like it's more of an epidemic because maybe it's just because 'cause I'm getting older and I'm hearing more and more people who have it. But the discussions are more around living with it. It isn't as much of a stigma, I suppose, or kind of a hush hush conversation as it was before. Are you finding that as well?
I think in certain cultures it still is. In certain cultures, in the Hispanic culture, in the Asian culture, it's still very much like you're embarrassed by it. Um, Native American culture, like the spirits, did something to you. That's not going to go away. That's just embedded cultural anthropology at this point now. But cancer is being made fun of in cartoons. It's in movies now. People don't die as much anymore in the media. You can joke about it in some strange ways. There's permission to just be open about it. Celebrities to talk about it, like everyone's okay with it now. I remember in 2004, the National Cancer Institute changed their mission. And I'm the only one that noticed this because I'm a nerd. Their mission was to cure cancer,
I
period.
was right. I was right. You are a nerd.
Yeah.
Eh,
But they changed their mission to eliminate death and suffering due to cancer.
mm,
It wasn't subtle. And I think the only one that noticed it. But the people that really did pay attention were like, you can't do that. We're not going to cure cancer. No, cancer is going to be a chronic condition that you hopefully live with or don't die from.
mhm, mhm.
I'll take that any day over dying right away, like I almost did and Deborah Winger did in terms of endearment. Right? If we can not have that and have something that's less shitty, I'll take it. So cancer as a chronic disease, sure. Is it going to suck? Yeah. Will it suck less than being dead? Of course. So is it is that a sort of a grand scheme? No. Would we like to have the end of cancer and whatever that means? Of course.
Yep, yep.
But we're at a precipice now with potentially not even getting in the first place. Start to look at, Gardasil and HPV cancers and what other medications like Yervo did for CML. I think we're getting to a point now where like you'll be able to get like cancer marker blood tests at Walmart in a couple of years that'll tell you if you are living with pre-cancer,
Wow.
that you can like then get things removed like without a colonoscopy. Um, what does retail don't get cancer look like in 5 years? Yes, you should diet, eat well, exercise, do all the things that reduce your risk, right? No Twinkies, no red food dye, maybe bourbon once in a while is fine. Day drinking while buying Robert Graham shirts is okay.
I love it.
But we're on such a wonderful precipice now where it'll need to be adopted by society in a way that you can spend $100 on a home test kit that tests your genetic predispositions across every possible marker, whether you're at risk for anything, whether it's epidemiologic or epigenetic or just congenital.
Yep. Well, I
Wouldn't you
think
like to know if you are at pre stomach cancer?
yeah.
Sure.
Well, and I think it would have to be adopted by physicians, wrap their
Yeah.
brains around it, that a different source is doing their job basically from a diagnosis standpoint. And insurance, of course, how is that going to be looked at as far as, okay, you've got a marker for XYZ. Now let's go find what it is, where it is. Do we take it out? Do we beam it up? Do we whatever? What do we do with it? What do you do with that information? If you know that you have a marker, certainly with breast cancer, let's say the BRCA gene marker, that's been out for a long, long time as far as that testing, but new testing on different cancers now, which is coming along. So what do you do with that I think is the big question.
Yeah. I think the goal is to get less people diagnosed in the first place by avoiding stage 1. Although stage 1 is obviously everyone would rather have stage 1 than stage anything above 1.
Yes.
But if the aspiration, of course, first of all, we're talking retail. I mean, Cologuard right now, you have to get a prescription for it. You need to talk to your doctor about a prescription. I'm talking like Cologuard as like 23andMe at Walmart.
Mhm.
Correct.
No,
They're
just
$99 for a home kit to know if you're at
pick
risk
that up and
pre.
yeah.
You're still going to need to go see a doctor. You're still going to need to see these things. But if you don't have to see a doctor yet, I think that's where they want to be. Where it would be non-prescriptive blood tests, non-prescriptive spit tests, ancestry, right? Just because, yeah, am I Nigerian? No. Do I have pre-esophageal cancer? Yes. Okay, I'm going to do what I can now to not get pre. I only have pre. And it really is in pancreatic, lung, colorectal, esophageal, and and uh, uh, stomach and uterine, where they can start to do blood tests on whether you're at risk, not even whether you have it. Are you at risk for it? So this notion of the words pre-cancer have to be enveloped into society's consciousness. So we're still going to have doctors and oncologists, but insurance doesn't matter if you're spending $99 at Walgreens to get this blood test. So they don't mind, because ideally more people will want to go see a doctor afterwards. Like, who's making money off of this? But
Exactly.
we're looking at a real bifurcation in the way people are identifying with their risks, because I just had someone on my show who was like a world-class athlete who teaches like sword fighting and karate and has zero body fat, and she got breast cancer. So, you can only do so much,
Yep.
and your genes may or may not be your destiny, but now we may have retail try to not get it.
And in the meantime, some people say, you know what? Drink the bourbon. Life
Yeah.
is right. Yeah.
Life is short. Drink the
Life is
bourbon.
short.
Yeah.
Matt, I know that you've been referred to as the Podfather, not the Godfather, but the Podfather, POD podcast, Podfather of healthcare or health advocacy. Who had knighted you that
I'll do a quick dime store. So after I couldn't go to grad school, I wound up fixing computers in the ad industry, which turned into a 10-year career in branding. I fell into Livestrong because I met my first cancer buddy in 2002, who was also brain tumor in his 20s, bald, Jewish, from New York City, like super cool. We're still friends. Named Craig Lustig. Craig was on the board of some of the Beltway groups that were running a lot of the early cancer advocacy policy work in DC. He also worked for Livestrong. So Livestrong, before the yellow wristbands took over, was doing some interesting work. And I was like, oh my God, where have you guys been? All those Gen Xers that were angry. Like, I finally found my tribe. They're the ones that helped me understand what needed to be done for the country for AYA, because they were incubating research and data. They're the ones that came up with this whole, the strategic plans on what do you do to get less Gen Xers, to die from cancer. And one of the people who I became a mentor with, her name was Selma Schimmel, God rest her soul. Selma was a young adult cancer survivor in the 80s and 90s. She had it like 11 times. But she was the first terrestrial radio cancer journalist in the 1990s and the early 2000s. She took AM radio equipment to cancer conferences all over the country and broadcast live and interviewed people live. And it was on AM radio. And then she recorded on a CD-ROM. Remember CD-ROM, kids?
yeah.
And gave out the CDs to all the people attending the conferences. Selma was offered the opportunity to take her AM radio show to internet, whatever that meant back then.
Mm-hmm.
Say, I can't do that, Matt, you do that. So Selma trained me on how to do radio and how to program an entirely NPR show. And I took over the digital version of her show, and it became the Stupid Cancer Show. And it launched on May 28th, 2007.
Oh,
So
God.
I've been doing this across thousands of episodes and thousands of guests and thousands of conversations across 4 specific podcasts and 1 documentary since May of 2007.
Yeah.
So
So when
someone said, I'm the Podfather. I'll take it. I own it. I love it.
That's awesome. That's a great title. So then when did Cancer Mavericks come along?
So Cancer Mavericks was a pandemic animal that I didn't own. Instead of buying a pandemic, a COVID dog, I made a COVID documentary.
That most people gave back, sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to tell the story of upon whose shoulders I stand and upon whose shoulders they stand. There was no, almost like a Ken Burns, David Attenborough level streaming audio series about the history of cancer advocacy in America. And past this prologue, and if you don't understand where we came from, you don't understand how far we have to go, how much better things are. So it took 18 months. I worked with folks from Slate PR and NBC podcasts, and we spent, it was a labor of love to storyboard 8 episodes with like a ton of B-roll waiting for season 2 to happen someday. But it debuted in 2022. It's been listened to nearly 1 million times, won 8 awards. Got under the radar in the mainstream because it really wasn't meant for mainstream, but I consider it like what do they call that? The appointment listening
Well,
for anyone in healthcare, anyone in advocacy, in any space, to understand what it took to even be identified as a human being first, and not a data point or a biological point in a lab. Just to acknowledge we are human beings first and foremost. We need to understand this as human beings. We're not lab rats. All of these stories and what breast cancer screening looked like in Harlem, with the Black Panthers, that's a real story. How just this gaggle of like boomers in their 30s went to Albuquerque to reinvent cancer survivorship in the 80s with the Orphan Drug Act and the Americans with Disability Act. And then we get into like the breast cancer wars and the die-ins and the advent of quality of life medications and what Livestrong stood for, what Stand Up to Cancer stood for, what Stupid Cancer did, and what it meant and what it means to advocate for people like you in this country.
Mhm.
And it's one of my proudest things I've ever accomplished. Just another wonderful little piece of media legacy for others to learn from.
And where can folks find that, Matt?
Cancer Mavericks is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. It's
Okay.
the only Cancer Mavericks. You can Google it. It's there.
I've listened to a few of your episodes, obviously, and a couple of your talks, and I understand that you like to ask some of your guests questions that AI might ask your guests. Is that right?
I've been an AI skeptic for a very long time, and I've come around to being able to use it in a way that helps me specifically, but I'm not doing crazy prompts that tell me how to bet on the stock market.
Got it.
I'm taking minimal risks with it, but on occasion I will feed it a whole bunch of information on my guests. I decided once I came back this season, I took a year off. I took a hiatus because I was
Mhm.
just exhausted. I came back this season, and every guest gets asked. The question is, I go to chat and I say, if this person were any character from TV, film, books, art, entertainment, and culture over the last 100 years, who would they be? Or a combination of who would they be?
Mhm.
And I just love to gamify the end of a show. And well, you're either Dorothy Gale, or you're Blanche Dubois, or you're, Tony Maselli, or you're Steven Spielberg. It's
love
just
it.
wonderful to see that that's a decent use of AI for my show.
Yeah. Well, I took your lead, and served up your website to ChatGPT and asked it to come up with some questions that it might want to ask you. Can we do that?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Fire away.
All right, here we go. There's some good ones here. Okay, let's start out with this one. So I know that you were given your brain tumor diagnosis by an answering machine, on an answering machine. Is that
Yes.
right? Okay. So if you had to deliver shocking medical news in the most ridiculous way possible today, how would you do it?
Paper airplane.
Okay. You refused chemo, survived radiation, and built a movement. If you had to sum up your life philosophy in a bumper sticker, what would it say?
Don't take any shit from anyone.
Okay. Since you love a good 80s reference, let's play this out. If your cancer journey were an 80s movie, who would play you? What's the soundtrack? And how does the final scene go?
Oh geez. Ferris Bueller
Nice.
in a DeLorean
Cool.
to Rockin' in the Free World.
Awesome. Okay.
Riding off into the sunset with Bruce Willis from Die Hard.
Perfect. ChatGPT really got into this, let me tell you. Next one. You've spent decades calling out the absurdities of the healthcare system. If you were supreme overlord of cancer, this is ChatGPT word. So there's
Okay.
another title for you. Supreme overlord of cancer care. There you go.
Sounds very Lord of the Rings. Go on.
It is. If you were supreme overlord of cancer care for a day, what's the first ridiculous thing you would fix?
I don't think universal health care is a solution. I think it's too complicated for this country. But I would put out, ironically, there is no law that exists for what I'm about to ask the world to do. I would like to put out regulations and restrictions on how health insurers deny coverage for critical procedures and to deal with price gouging at the hospital level, lacking disclosures, and to eliminate, if possible, medical bankruptcy from cancer treatment. So if I'm overlord, I will do all of those.
You're overlord. What would be the next thing you would do?
How political can we get?
Go for it. Go for it, Matt.
I kind of like what RFK is talking about as far as getting seed oils and, all the agribusiness pollution that's been pumping into our kids and plastics. Like we become a robotic society without realizing it. What agribusiness has done since the 1970s should be a war crime against humanity. And look no further than checking ingredients on Fruit Loops in London versus Fruit Loops in our supermarkets here in the States. It's an atrocity what they've allowed agribusiness to do to poison us. It is no surprise. That article in Time Magazine that talks about the uptick in cancer in pediatrics and young adults, it turns out it's not population adjusted. They're just getting sick more. And it's not just cancer. I know they're focused on cancer because it's like a shiny object. But obesity, diabetes, what's it called? Endometriosis, women's issues, rheumatoid arthritis, they're all happening now in younger people. Because of the way we eat.
Yep.
Autoimmune.
Yep.
We didn't have gluten shit and allergies back in the 80s, right? We didn't have this stuff. We used to play with and eat dirt.
And drink from the hose, God.
And drink from the hose, right? And we didn't have sunscreen, we had oil.
That's
Nothing
right.
but,
Oh man.
we ate butter and lard and had all these crazy, things. And no one's perfect, and we're gonna have to see what he winds up doing with his position as the head of the HHS. But if he's going to be able to ban corn oil or ban pesticides or create better farming or laws that keep the slaughterhouses not across the street from the cornfields, those are things that I think would really make a difference. Getting Monsanto to go the fuck away, banning all the stuff that we know is carcinogenic. The American Chemistry Council are the worst fuckers in the country. And we came up against them for years on how do you add more carcinogenic oversight to the shit that's going in our food and water and cosmetics. So it was a lot. We can go deeper on 11 other podcasts about that,
I would love
but
to.
it's all about the shit we're eating that we don't even know we're eating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and I'm glad that it's coming to light, coming more to the media, because I think we all need to be looking at the labels more often to begin with. But yeah, I would love to talk more about that. What's next for you, and how can folks support you and all that you're doing in your work?
No, and I appreciate that. I mean, the simplest thing to do is just subscribe to my show. The more listeners I get, the more impact I can have, the better, not the better guests, but the more guests I get. It's the notoriety of who wants to be angry with me and learn with me, and take an active role with me. I'm working on something stealth right now, which is really, really big. We can talk about this offline. Not ready for prime time, but I'll tease it as something bigger than stupid cancer and bigger than Livestrong.
Mm. I am intrigued.
Yeah.
Any target date for that?
Um, I'm hoping to release some variant of it by my birthday, my 51st birthday on May 29th.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that big announcement.
Next act.
Your next act. That's right. Matt, thank you so much for being with me today. You have a open invitation here anytime, and I know that there's hundreds of more things that we can talk about, and I love a good tangent or 2 or 12, whatever. So I'm all about it and would love to have you back. So thank you so much for being here.
This was an absolute pleasure, Laura.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, this is the Desperate for Diagnosis podcast. I'm Laura Nozicka. Stay well and keep pushing for answers.
Oh my goodness, that's a wrap on another compelling story. Thanks for listening to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. If you would like more information about today's guests or to find out more about Laura, go to desperateforadiagnosis.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow show updates and healthcare news on the podcast's Facebook page. If you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions, advice, or suggestions for our guests, please email me at lauramarie@desperateforadiagnosis.com. Please note, I am not a medical professional, nor am I affiliated with any healthcare, pharmaceutical, or device company. I am an entrepreneur and an independent market researcher focused on helping healthcare organizations better understand the patient perspective. The podcast is not meant to offer medical advice, but to merely share the stories and perspectives of podcast guests.